Okay, we are going to get rolling. Hi, everyone, and thanks for being here tonight. I will make an announcement, which is one of the reasons why we were delayed. Apologies for the delay. Is that two of our panelists were having some challenges and haven't been able to get on to the webinar yet. And so we were waiting and trying to see if we could get that resolved. It has not been yet. So we will hope that they're able to join. But in the interest of having this conversation and not keeping everyone waiting indefinitely, we are going to jump right in. So bear with us. I sometimes find that the most beautiful things are the things that went wrong, quote unquote, and you just allowed to flow organically. So that's what we're going to do tonight. And I hope you all are down for the ride. So I'm going to stop talking now and we'll start our flow and our introductions.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel event, Cancel Rent, Housing Justice in a Post-COVID United States. My name is Vanessa Olguin. I am a junior in the College of Arts and Sciences, majoring in government in the Interdisciplinary College Scholar Program, and I'm really excited to welcome everyone here to our event today. Thank you to the Cornell Political Union and the Price Initiative for hosting this discussion. The Cornell Political Union is a group of undergraduates passionate about politics and, and committed to finding common ground by engaging in respectful discussion and debate. The politics of race, immigration, class, and ethnicity, or PRICE. The PRICE Initiative is a brand new initiative at Cornell's Department of Government that works to expand and enrich research, teaching, and engagement around race, immigration, class, ethnicity, and related intersections. You can find more information on each respective organization at their websites that are posted in the chat. Now, as we begin our discussion on housing justice and policy, I would like to first acknowledge the land on which many of us are on today. Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayohono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayohono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayohono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayohono people, past and present, to these lands and waters. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Giancarlo Valdetaro and Professor Michener. Giancarlo Valdetaro is a junior from Northern Virginia studying government and history. He has been involved in electoral politics since he was 15 years old and took a year off from school to work on state legislative elections for the Democratic Party of Georgia in 2020. Professor Jamila Michener is an associate professor of government, co-director of the Cornell Center for Health Equity, and co-director of the Price Initiative.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Vanessa. And while we hope, for our other two panelists to join us, including Assemblywoman Mitaynes, who recently finished a hunger strike to fight for funding excluded workers in the New York State budget, which as of yesterday appears to have been a successful effort. Would like to let Professor Michener introduce Professor Rodriguez. Oh, Professor Michener.
Sorry, yes, I'm literally, I was communicating with Assemblywoman, the Assemblywoman, and trying to help her get on. So apologies for the delay. Okay, I have the distinct honor of giving a little background on Akira Drake Rodriguez. And there's a part of me that wants to just, tell you all how I became slightly for a period of time, Twitter obsessed with her because I like her tweets. And you can tell a lot about a person, not everything that you need to know, but a lot by their tweets. And so Professor Drake Rodriguez is an assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And her, she's in the city and regional planning. And her work really focuses, I think, on some crucial aspects of housing in the context of urban planning. I think the most important thing for me to say is that she has an amazing book coming out with the University of Georgia Press. And the title of the book is Deviance in Divergent Spaces, The Radical Politics of Atlanta's Public Housing. And something that I really appreciate and enjoy about Professor Drake Rodriguez's work is that she really thinks about the kind of political context of housing and the role it plays in building power. And I think that's going to be an important part of our conversation tonight. And I'm super, super thrilled to have her with us. And I think the book isn't out yet, but it's coming out, right?
I have a copy right here. I'm not going to hold it up. I'm too embarrassed.
Oh, why not? I want you to hold it up. And I want everyone who the spirit moves to go and order the book.
Hold on to that. This is my book. I like the way it feels. So thank you. And thank you for that. Lovely.
Beautiful as holding your book in your hand. So,
Yeah,
but
right.
except maybe for the experience, we'll all have reading it. So, okay, I'm going to ping it back to Giancarlo now, who is going to introduce the Assemblywoman for us. I'm so glad you were able to get on. Thank you so much for joining us. Go ahead, Giancarlo.
Yeah, so now somebody that I discovered myself, like for myself through Twitter, Assemblywoman Marcela Mitaynes represents Assembly District 51, which includes Red Hook, Sunset Park, and Northern Bay Ridge in Brooklyn, New York. After her own eviction from a rent-stabilized apartment that she had lived in for 3 decades, she became herself involved in local tenant advocacy, including helping pass 2019's landmark Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act before running and winning elected office herself last year. And as I mentioned, before she was able to jump on, she's actually fresh off of a hunger strike to fund excluded workers in the New York State budget, which was successful not only in getting that fund included, but also in winning significant relief for tenants and other housing insecure individuals in the New York State budget. So Assemblywoman Mitaynes, thank you so much for joining us today. Oh, I think you might be muted. Let me see if that's...
Sorry. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and to join you today.
Yeah, of course. And so to jump right into our conversation, the first area that we wanted to talk about was the eviction crisis that is posed by COVID, one that has been affecting people throughout the pandemic and will not end, when the last vaccine goes into somebody's arm. So, one of the first things we wanted to start with in our overview of how we have responded and how we should respond is asking both of you what you thought the most impactful government policy that you saw passed for housing security was since the pandemic started.
And can I quickly add before you all jump into that, just for all of the attendees, at any point along the way, if anything comes up that sparks a question or some interest for you, please put your questions in the Q&A through the, give us your questions through the Q&A. It's never too early to start with that, but throughout, remember to offer your questions, because we will transition from this more moderated discussion to kind of engaging your own questions. So, okay, now to Giancarlo's question.
Yeah, I can go first. It was a huge campaign that was underwent called Cancel the Rent, and that's exactly what we wanted to do. Through no fault of their own, we're just all in a pandemic. People lost their jobs. People have to deal with health issues, and people had to deal with loved ones that they lost. And so what we saw was people just going deeper and deeper into rental debt because of the pandemic. And what we really wanted to do was be able to eliminate all that rent debt and give folks a fresh start. And so we've been able to pass $100 million for hardship funds for those to be able to access. And I'm really proud at the fact that there aren't going to be barriers for those for our immigrant neighbors, and that they're going to be able to do a self-attestation. So a lot of folks sometimes don't have documents or paperwork to be able to prove, that they lost employment. And so that's going to be a huge help really for our communities. And so I'm really excited about that. There's also a commitment of $100 million to help reduce homelessness. I was disappointed that we weren't able to do more. There's certainly additional assistance that's needed, but this is the beginning of a start. And, with threat being due right around the corner, I think that one of the things that we were telling folks is, we were asking them to hold on as we continue to fight. And, the eviction moratorium was in place to actually, hold off evictions. And now that that's going to also open up the housing courts, I think there was a lot of fear. So this is not only going to be able to cover 1 year's worth of back rent. There's a commitment that comes with this money once it's paid. Landlords cannot raise the rent for the next year, and they also can't evict their tenants for the next year. And for those that need it, they can also apply for an additional 3 months moving forward for rental assistance. So it's a huge, huge step in the right direction, but definitely a lot more that we should be doing, a lot more that we need to do.
Yeah, that was awesome. I am not seeing that level of effort being matched in the state of Pennsylvania, but certainly locally in Philadelphia, which is a bit more liberal, there are mechanisms being put into place that are meant to augment the moratorium and work to not necessarily, they're not at the cancel rent stage, but they are in the process stage where before eviction, there have to be a certain level of mediations and a certain, you have to apply for the relief before you can begin those proceedings. And so I'm really sort of heartened by the attention to the actual process of eviction. Like you said, like removing those barriers so that you can stay in place, but also making it not this like easy fill out a form, take it down to an office and let the sheriff and all of these other forms of the state take care of it, but actually having a landlord be accountable, sitting at the table with a tenant, explaining this reason and going through a mediation process as opposed to another form of the judiciary system. And so I'm certainly heartened by that. Although, like you said, it's not quite enough. We had some concessions with an encampment in Philadelphia over the summer and the fall, where there's efforts in the works to create a community land trust of affordable housing in the city. And as you can imagine, that is progressing more slowly, for example, than some of the other efforts. And so certainly this is an opportunity to see more creative housing policy and more direct aid, like for example, that 100 million of just getting rid of those barriers, that's amazing. But hopefully it's starting a conversation too, so that these are permanent policies that we see after.
Yeah, that's that question of what's going to be a temporary and kind of proximate response to COVID and what's going to be more longstanding is really critical. And I guess I want to kind of direct our attention there, right? Because these kinds of housing injustices and housing insecurity and precarity, predated COVID and have been, I think I'm always a little critical of the language of crisis because it makes it seem like we're in this temporary moment that was sparked by like proximate causes that we will then have policy to solve and we'll move on beyond the crisis. And in many ways, we've been in a perpetual housing crisis for many years, which takes a little bit of the kind of meaning of crisis away. But it, the ongoing sort of what feels like perennial crisis was just exacerbated by COVID to a point where it absolutely couldn't be ignored anymore. And I think, like Professor Drake Rodriguez pointed out, that brings certain opportunities. It has brought certain opportunities. But I am curious and want to hear the panelists speak to what it looks like to change housing, either on the policy level or on any other level, in a way that is going to provide true security and true access in a sort of long-term sense for all. Like, and that might feel far away, or it might feel impossible, but I guess I want us to sort of think creatively and in a big way together about what a future looks like where a crisis, a recession, a natural disaster, a pandemic doesn't create the kind of havoc that COVID has created, because we actually have a secure system where everybody has access to secure housing. Like, what does that look like for you all, and what kinds of policies or social or economic transformations do you think are necessary to get there eventually?
Yeah, I definitely don't have like all of that answer, but I can start
Nobody does.
by saying, like, when you asked the first question, I was like, in my head, like, some of the best policies have not been housing policies. Like, it's like a stimulus and like free internet and things like that have like made your home more comfortable, your commute more bearable, these things that are part of the home and the home life and the community. That I think has been really helpful. Obviously, we're seeing mutual aid networks sprout out again. We're seeing, we were seeing some more community perhaps at the beginning of the pandemic, and things are kind of fracturing again towards the end. But certainly you could see that there were some beginnings to think more comprehensively about the role of the home in the life, and the role of the home in health, in ways that I think were really quite important. Accessibility, the fact that I've done like 8 panels today in different cities and conferences and things. And so that's wonderful that we are able to do this, but like, let's not like throw that away. But this sort of access, this sort of, extending out the hand that the government is doing in this time of crisis is something that needs to be more permanent. It should not be canceled rent, for the 6 months or for the 3 months. It should be, there's always going to be a population that can't pay this rent. And so, like, what do we do, right? And as crisis grows, that population will grow. But as the crisis goes away, I don't think that population of those who are in crisis is going to shrink at the same degree either. So certainly, I think it is, obviously more than housing policy for this to actually work.
Yeah, I think I very much agree with you. There's certainly a need to look at housing in a different way. And, I truly believe that housing is a basic human right. And in order for us to be able to act on that, then we have to move away from this capitalist society that we live in, where a property owner's rights is valued more than those of the tenants. And this idea of being able to commodify housing, linked in with the fact that people make money off of the homeless shelter. I think that it's going to take a lot more to change that, and certainly people are moving in that direction, right? We're talking about community land trust, we're talking about social housing, but unless we truly believe that housing is a human right, we're not going to be able to move in that direction where everyone's going to be entitled and has a right to live in a dignified home.
Can I just really quickly jump in and just directly, I think what you said is absolutely on the mark, Assemblywoman, and it's inspiring to hear an elected official talking that way. And it makes me wonder and sort of sparks my own interest in how you navigate the space of like formal political institutions, right? Being an elected official, while having that perspective that, in my view, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but in my view is like pretty rare among electeds to be able to say, we're gonna have to move away from capitalism. We're gonna have to stop people from profiting off of homeless shelters, right? Anything that sounds like decommodification or massive transformation of our economic system is very much out of step with the approaches that we see like coming from most politicians and most kind of like policy intervention. So I'm just wondering like how you hold that space and how it affects your ability to be in your role, right? And yeah, I guess that I don't know if that's clear, but I'm just kind of like, how are you
It's
as an elected?
100. Yeah, it's 100% clear, and I think we even see it in your response, right? The fact that this is not something that you hear very commonly, but for me, it's definitely like my roots and where I come from, right? I got displaced from a home that I lived in with my family for over 30 years. I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't know about gentrification. Suddenly I got a new landlord, and within 6 months, he was able to displace half the families in a 35-unit rental apartment in Brooklyn. And so it's definitely challenging to occupy those spaces now as a legislator, because even when you're in conference with your colleagues and trying to kind of have a discussion about bills that you're bringing forward, it becomes very clear that some of these politicians are very much in favor of keeping the status quo and keeping things the way that they are, because they too are profiting from it, right? These are elected officials who also own properties and are landlords. And so it is very out of the norm when I share my ideas and my thoughts, right? And I think that that's the way our government is kind of used to working, right? Like, I'm coming in with my ideas, and somehow I'm made to feel like I'm the one that's wrong. And so it's difficult, but at the same time, it's very, very needed to be able to say that we are, as government, providing for our people, and most importantly, providing for the most needed, right? I think that's definitely been challenging, but it's also been years of neglect from our elected officials to really see this as a problem, right? And so I've been able to connect with folks based on that. I was able to run on a platform where I believe that housing has a human right. I was able to run and use my 10 years worth of experience advocating and organizing for tenants, working in coalitions, organizing not just tenants in my community, in my district, but being able to organize tenants at the local, city, state, and federal level. And really understanding that being able to educate tenants on their rights, empowering them to make decisions, and really giving them the tools and showing them the way that they can actually guide policy that we can then enact to start making some of those changes, but most importantly, to really start providing for our most needy. It's challenging, it certainly is.
Yeah, I can respect that. That's super helpful to hear your perspective there.
And I think going off of that, I think one question that I had for you, Assemblywoman Mitaynes, as well as you, Professor Rodriguez, is we haven't just seen policy responses to the eviction crisis that COVID has posed. We have seen some actions reminiscent of times in the Great Depression when evictions would be with force protested by people trying to make sure that others were able to stay in their homes. And we have seen more collective community actions. And I think, you alluded to this, Assemblywoman Mitaynes, but what do both of you see as the roles of non-policy specific action, the action that's outside of government actors in times like these and going forward generally?
One thing that I think is really changing and what I've noticed is really important is like the distance of the landlord from the property. Like as our landlord class becomes more globalized and more institutionalized, it's much harder to do like a hardcore, like direct action eviction stoppage because of that. There's no shame, when you can't go to the doorstep of the landlord or to the door of the bank that is threatening to foreclose you when it's like this big global entity. So I do think, once again, kind of like leveraging some of these wider social networks, and you're seeing it in New York with the Upstate Downstate Alliance, but like really thinking in much, much broader coalitions and, organizing across those scales from local, state, and national, because it is that level of attention that is needed to sort of make these really, really big claims about evictions and the role of housing precarity in everyday life. I do feel that it is so far removed because of that. It's not this close relation anymore. It's your neighbors who, were displaced, and then another came in and they were displaced. And so the turnover is even getting so rapid that it's hard to create those bonds and tenant associations and organizing coalitions. So I do think that there is some of these, even events like this, where like people are learning about different actions and getting informed across these networks, I think are really, really critical as we move forward.
Yeah, I think that as much as possible, people are getting very creative on ways of doing direct action, but certainly being able to know who the landlord actually is, knowing how to contact them, has become harder and harder when some property owners just have an address or a mailbox. But these are the things that are very important: press conferences, rallies. It's a way that the community can kind of share things that they're going through. And I think that as much as possible, um, folks are now coming together more and more because they're tired of their seeing their communities disrupted. They're tired of seeing, their neighbors being pushed out and priced out. And so there's a collective want to not just preserve uh, the makeup of their community, but especially during the pandemic where everyone is struggling, right? This is no one's fault. No one should be losing their home because of something that is no fault of their own, And so really wanting to kind of like figure out a way of being able to help people. And so some of the stuff we're seeing here is um, folks really coming together when they're finding out that someone's being evicted and trying to block these evictions, trying to use different forms of shaming the landlord in what they're doing, forming tenant unions, forming tenant associations, right? And a lot of it is just, learning from each other and really sharing that information and figuring out how we can all work together. And it's a really beautiful thing to see.
Yeah, I mean, I'll like second that and third that and all the way to infinity. I've been doing some work, some research work on tenant organizing, and have been spending a lot. I haven't talked to you about it, Akira. Well, we have to, yeah. And talking to tenant unions and tenant organizations all over the country about what they're doing and how they're doing it, and some of these things, right? Eviction blockades and direct actions and shutting down the eviction courts and and a lot of tenants' rights, like informational processes to make sure people know about what can and can't happen. We've had all these moratoria, one after the other after the other. The average person can't keep track of what's legal, what's not legal, what their landlord can do, what their landlord can't do. And so these kinds of, community organizations, many of them like tenant-led and membership-based, are filling this role of not only trying to build power, which is what I hear us really talking about here, which is, building power among people who are otherwise marginalized in the housing space and in many other spaces, but also trying to just inform and equip people about the rights that they do have, right? Building power is about extending and expanding so we have more, right? Because even the rights that we have don't amount to housing as a human right. So we need more than that, and that's going to take power. But at least for the rights we have, we ought to know about them and be able to exercise them in the face of often predatory landlords. And so there's so much for organizers to do, and a lot of these organizations are either just starting off, or they have limited resources and capacity, and they're just putting in the heart and soul and elbow grease to try to create transformation. It's super inspiring to see. But often they meet an electoral space or a formal political space that is quite hostile. It's one of the reasons why it's super exciting to have you on this panel, Assemblywoman, because it's a very different perspective from someone in your position. But it's a hard, kind of complicated political space and terrain to navigate, either on the election side, right, or on the kind of like the community and neighborhood people power side, So the way that we've been kind of talking about both throughout this conversation is really exciting to me. So, this is something that comes up again and again whenever I do a panel about anything, honestly. People ask this question where they say, well, what can I do? And I personally always am like, I don't know. There's a million things. It depends on you and who you are and what your sphere of influence is and all of that. But I guess if you had to sort of tell anyone who's watching or who will watch the recording of this, hey, here's something you can go out and do that is going to help move us forward in this space and get us out of this point of perpetual, perennial, I would say, induced in many ways by our economic system crisis. What would that look like? What kinds of, and it could be on any level, it can be really concrete or it can be more general or abstract. But what would you tell folks as far as how to move forward in a productive way and making a difference in this area?
Certainly, it's always helpful just to organize where you are and stay in those communities and conversations that are producing this form of organizing and accountability. Just a really, really exciting moment. And I think organizing, so many people are kind of deterred from it because it feels like you have to be boots on the ground and really sort of intense and doing this direct action work when, there's a need for lawyers, there's a need for people who can fundraise, people who can write grants, people who can provide structure to some of these issues, I think are really quite important. I always talk about the loss of Acorn and how the loss of that national infrastructure was really, really, really messed up. And so anyone who can start an Acorn anytime soon, there is a big listener out there, that would be great. Legal aid attorneys and people who can who can translate this stuff. I work with the Housing Justice League in Atlanta, and the amount of fair housing lawyers that are giving their free time down there to explain the 3 different county eviction processes that are happening in the Atlanta metro area are quite astonishing. So I do think that there's plenty of ways for people to fit into this process, and it really takes everyone to do something, because you can't shift this ideology of housing as a commodity and as an investment through policy only. It is like a whole cultural reset. And so I really do think that however people can push these conversations, the fact that we're even on a cancel rent, I had a student come to me in the summer talking about, oh, I want to work on this cancel rent. I was like, I don't know what the hell you're talking about. Like, what are you like, what is this cancel rent? Like, and like now here I am on this panel. She's already laughing her ass off right now thinking about that, because like she really did tell me. And so, you know, this year has been really, you know, like on an Occupy level, like shifting the conversation from one of like, oh, some people are rich and some people are poor and the good people are rich and that's the way it is, to like income equality and like, you know, these are things that we need to change. And I do think this is a moment of cancel rent where this is a time to change, and we need to build on that momentum.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think organizing is really important. And, you know, you don't have to, I often tell people, you don't have to start with a bunch of people. It can be small. But understanding the type of housing that you live in, understanding your basic rights, and then moving from there. Certainly, it's been much more difficult now because of quarantining, because of COVID, and because currently things are changing constantly and very rapidly. But there's certainly, you know, community organizations that are willing to help. There's free attorneys that are willing to help. And so it's important to start somewhere, and you can start off small and then build. But I really think that when looking for answers of what to do, it's really those people with those lived experiences that know um, what they need to do or what things need to change, and you can certainly start from there.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. So maybe we can jump into the Q&A now, right? We have a couple questions, and anyone in the audience who continues to kind of think about questions, feel free to throw them in the Q&A, but we'll jump in. Giancarlo, do you want to start?
Yeah, so one thing that we have gotten a couple questions on is looking for y'all to speak to some of the differences between urban and rural communities that are faced with respect to housing policy, and you know what can be done, especially in more rural areas that don't you know, have some of these pre-existing community organizations or governments that are, you know, looking to help people, even to the small degree that a lot of municipal governments have been looking to aid their citizens so far through this pandemic. So, you know, what are those differences between urban and rural communities, and how can those rural communities kind of take some of these actions to, you know, despite the, you know, lack of a head start compared to urban areas?
Yeah, I think that the rural areas certainly pose a challenge because of the distance that people live. Um, you know, being able to have where before you wanted to physically be together, that you have the ability to either have like a phone conference or be able to do it online. I think the most important thing is really understanding the type of housing that you live in and wanting to find other folks that live in the same type of housing to be able to connect, to find out what their issues are and what help they've been able to get. And there may not be a community organization in your rural town, but it's most likely that, you know, there are folks in another town are having the same issue and the same problem, and they're passively connected to someone. And so the internet is really a great place to kind of find these spaces and get some information. And it's certainly challenging, but not impossible. The need is certainly so much greater that you're able to connect with people, and when you're able to support each other, it's easier to try and find answers and to be able to start working toward making a difference. In organizing, we always say we don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's most likely that there's information out there and there's someone else that's kind of gone through the same thing that is already kind of set up shop that you can tap into. And that's really what you're trying to look for.
Yeah, I agree. I think the rural issue is a very real one. Common similarities being kind of the control of land by a pretty small group of people. So very similar often in urban issues, that there may be a lot of more options in urban areas, places to live, but very few landlords and very few options there. And so certainly I agree, using pre-existing networks to organize, right? So there may not be a tenant association, but there could be a church. So like taking advantage of those natural networks and natural funds, like using government agencies, there could be public housing there that has a tenant association already, or there could be some kind of social services that can give you some grant money to get, internet and get started on that organizing. And so definitely finding like-minded peers and people who are similarly situated. But really interesting parallels with rural areas trying to preserve mobile housing. And so I definitely think that maybe even urban tenant associations need to be thinking more strategically about making that outreach into rural areas as well, because truly there is some similarities and there is some weaknesses, and having that divide be kind of artificially there.
Yeah, and I would just that last point is exactly what I was thinking. And I've talked to just a few urban tenant unions in sort of major cities, but in states that have a lot of kind of rural areas, and for whom rural areas aren't that far away. And one kind of both challenge and I think goal is to kind of better incorporate rural areas, because it's absolutely true that there are some core challenges that kind of cross kind of the urban rural divide, right? Like exploitative landlords are in urban contexts and they're in rural contexts, right? Sometimes they're the same landlords, right? Or who have the same management companies, right? And are exercising the same practices, right? And so I think this notion of what kind of housing do you have? Who's the landlord? Often there are these corporate entities, like Millennium or whatever, and they're everywhere in urban areas and rural areas. And once you can identify that common thread, it creates a basis for organizing across space, which of course means that you get some extra really nice things too, for example, cross-racial organizing, right? And even some just kind of cross-cultural organizing spaces that, and that stuff is challenging, but it's really important, just because renters and tenants cross all of those, right? There are certainly disproportionalities when it comes to race and when it comes to lots of other things, but the idea of working across those spaces, while not perfect and challenging, seems really important given the underlying similarities. Okay, maybe we'll jump into, we have a couple other questions here. I would like to read one. Are we not supposed to say who the questions are from? But the audience can tell, right? They can see the Q&A. Okay, great. So I'm going to read this one from Kevin Simowitz, because I know Kevin, and he's I like him a lot. He's also an organizer himself, so I think the question speaks to a bit of a real kind of deep knowledge of some of the context here. But Kevin asks our amazing panelists, I agree, to kind of speak to the ways that finance, insurance, real estate have become dominant forces, within the 21st century in terms of capital. And Kevin says those forces are often viewed as exercising power specifically within the housing sector, but how do you see the expansion of finance and real estate into the broader political economy? Is that a threat, right? And potentially, is it an opportunity as far as organizing and coalition building, right? So really puzzling through and thinking together about this role of finance, both in terms of housing and in terms of the larger kind of political economy broadly. So there's a lot there. it's a lot to chew on. And so maybe we can just pick the pieces that jump out as kind of relevant and important from your perspectives to address there.
I can start. Certainly, I think like what it sounds like you're describing is like financialization of like all of these different sectors where our decisions, particularly our governing decisions, are driven by financial outcomes. So is this profitable? Is this something worth investing in? Is this where we should drive all of our resources? Is based on these notions of risk and profitability. The use of real estate, the empty towers that we're building, the construction of new housing for rental purposes are obviously suggesting that finances is having a undue and unhealthy influence on our economy. Whether or not this, certainly it's a threat, that's clear. Is it a coalition building opportunity? I will never say no to that. It's really hard to see these processes, I think, as they're happening. They're so rapid, they're going across the globe at this point, and it is just breaking people down. Resources are being broken apart, networks are being broken apart, people are being displaced, people are dealing with climate displacement and financial displacement and housing displacement, political displacement, religious displacement. And so there's a lot of uncertainty that I see coming out that I think the instability of daily life is what is making it hard to build these coalitions, I think. And the kind of invisibility of the role of finance in some of these outcomes, like how do you determine that the $8 skirt that I'm wearing today is like part of this horrible fast fashion supply chain that is causing all of this? So I do think that a lot of things are hidden from our view that make it a little easy, that make it harder to build those coalitions. So I do think as we're building them that there should be a focus on how these financializations are creating these different fractures in our daily life, because these big concepts they're very apparent in the day-to-day. Someone purchased my home and now I'm displaced 6 months later, so that's like a very obvious tie, but some of the other issues may be too hidden and maybe making it harder for us to build those coalitions.
Yeah, I think certainly part of the issue is that the government has moved away from being responsible and providing for its people and depending on, this capitalist society who is then making money off of the creation of what's supposed to be affordable housing. The other issue with that is, it's they're in it for profit. They're not in it to wanting to provide affordable housing. So I think the other thing that we need to look at is really trying to see how we can preserve the current affordable housing that we have. How do we extend tenant protections to housing units that currently maybe don't have them, right? And how do we, and then also thinking about long-term investments. And certainly having a developer come in and build it is not the way to do it. And a lot of times it's really the government giving just way too much away to these developers. And what they're doing to our communities is, just building housing that's market rate, that's inaccessible to the people that currently live there, making it more expensive for the folks that currently live there to be able to continue to live there as a result of it. So really, really understanding what the role of government should be. And again, this has to do with, having political will and having a real desire to wanting to house people who need it.
Yeah, and I think going off of that political will and the role of government, we have a question in the chat from John Duvall, who I know personally, who was asking about, we talked earlier about how we've had an ongoing housing crisis for years, and how recessions or pandemics or natural disasters only exacerbate them and increase the population of people who are in crisis. But John was wondering how, legislators like yourself, Assemblywoman, and other actors in the systems we have can, for lack of better circumstances, leverage the capital, the political capital from these situations to not only ameliorate the harm that people are going through right now, but create those long-term solutions, especially given the context that you were elected last year in the primary with 4 or 5 other Democratic Socialists in the New York area. So all of a sudden, there were 4 or 5 other members of the legislature who were, kind of advocating a lot of the same positions as yourself. So I was wondering how both of you, or John was wondering how both of you think that, we can both solve these problems in the moment without losing sight of the long term.
I think part of it is understanding that we have to build political capital. When I first started getting into tenant advocacy and organizing and participating in coalitions, I was like everyone else who didn't know about my rights that was suddenly evicted. The more I learned about the laws that existed, the more I realized that the laws actually allowed landlords to easily evict their tenants and get higher paying tenants in. And so part of that is really educating folks to build a movement to try and make these changes. But that only worked so far, right? It took us 10 years to get the historic rent laws that we did. And that's because part of it was us coming to a realization that we had to become involved in political races, right? The current elected officials were not supporting the needs of the people. And so that meant that we had to make sure that we were putting people in the position of power that can actually enact these changes that we needed. And so that takes time. But certainly that was part of it, right? I was able to unseat a 26-year incumbent in a crowded 4-way race. That was possible because in the election prior, there was a senator who got elected who ran on a platform of housing, right? That's not something that was done before, but that was like the changes that we needed. He was integral in helping to pass legislation that allowed us to then come back and continue to pick up that mantle and keep fighting and moving forward. And so that's how we're really going to be able to make these changes. They're not going to happen overnight, but an investment in assuring that our representatives are really representing the people and being able to hold them accountable. I think that that's the other thing that's really missing, that we need to make sure that folks are civically engaged, that they understand the way the different levels of government work, and that they understand that their civic duty doesn't begin and end at the ballot box, but that they need to continue to be a presence to ensure that the elected official is pushing the policies that they want. And so that's really what made it successful, is the fact that you had the tie-in from the people that were going to be directly impacted and started building a movement where you slowly started making these changes to get us to where we were. Now, that being said, there was 4 of us that are DSA members that got elected. That along with one other DSA member that was already in office. And so now you've got, these progressive, very leftist elected officials entering political office. And so there's definitely been a shift in the way people think. We have, we're certainly very criticized and being told we're very idealistic and also very opinionated. But the difference is also that we have been able to inspire the progressives that are already in office to want to do more, and are slowly moving those moderate Democrats to the left a little bit. And so again, that is understanding and being able to build political capital. And that's not going to happen overnight. That takes time, but it's certainly doable. And so while there's 5 DSA members in elected office now, there's actually a 6th one that decided to join us. And so we're looking at, continuing to make changes, and the changes that we're making. And again, I use my example of being able to unseat a 26-year incumbent, is because people are tired of the lip service, tired of being told that these things aren't possible, tired of being told that this is the best that they can do, and knowing and seeing that there is much more there. And so the tie-in is really the base of the movement and how you move forward.
I don't have too much to comment on that, but I wholeheartedly agree. I think one of the idea that people who organize can go into positions of power and affect change by building these coalitions and shifting people further towards their policy agendas, I think is really the history of tenant organizing. There's just this very long history of people going from tenant organizing to office because of those very reasons. But I also think it's super important for movements to be in close contact with elected officials, because eviction is changing every second. The ways in which you can evict people are obviously beyond just having the sheriff bring their stuff out into the street, but turning off their utilities, removing appliances and doing all of these horrible things as a way of getting people out that may not be accounted for or may not have any action or recourse for. And so I do think that part of this shifting of capitalism is sort of undoing and understanding those loopholes that are exploited that make it impossible to get housing as a human right.
Yeah, wow, those answers sparked so much thought for me, but I'm going to hold myself back and continue to work through the questions. So there are a bunch and that we still have to get through, but one sort of maybe commonality that I see in some of the questions is a kind of wondering what about the landlords, right? Which this is something I feel often comes up in conversations around housing, and I tend to want to really be censored on the tenants, right? The folks that are most vulnerable. But it's obviously a dynamic, and landlords are actors as well, and they're both actors through the mechanism of often, capital, which we talked about earlier, and kind of financialization, and they're playing a role there. But, there's one question, I think often one question is well, what about small landlords who are regular middle-class people, right? Are they really exploitative? Are they really predatory, right? Those are words that I've used in this conversation. And I think that often people will say that, wait a minute, well, my parents own a house and they have renters, my uncle is a landlord and has a couple tenants. Our small landlords can be middle-class people trying to get ahead themselves. And then there's this other related question is well, what can government do for the landlords? Can they provide them with subsidies so that they don't have to evict? And so it's this larger question of what about the landlords? Are they necessarily the kind of predatory bad people? And can they, or how can they be supported through government policy? I have so many thoughts on that, but I'm much more interested in y'all's thoughts. So I'm holding myself back and opening the space for you.
My parents are landlords. It's an investment. So I find it strange sometimes in US discussions that there's this entitlement to gaining a profit in housing. that property owners need to keep their housing values up, that developers need to make their bottom lines work, that landlords have to get a profit. And I don't think that's necessarily a right or an entitlement the way that housing is. Like there's this, I don't understand when we're in discussions about cities and how to produce housing, they're like, well, this is how much it costs to develop a unit. And you're like, according to what? And you look at all the line items and they're all people who are earning profits. Architects and, designers and contractors and all, and everyone, and then the developer fees. And so everyone gets a profit and then maybe we'll get a home. And so like the home is like, oh, that's a benefit too. But it's like, but this is not a jobs program. This is not an investment strategy. This is not a job. People have purchased their homes and they've decided to rent them because that is an investment choice. There is no instrument in history where you are guaranteed a profit on your investment, but we will go that extra mile to make sure that with the rent relief, that money is going directly to landlords, it's not going to the resident. And so that is their subsidy. And so they are probably the most subsidized group in this country, way more than literally anyone else. And so I find it weird that we are so intent to save developers profits while there are people without homes. The name of the panel is Cancel Rent.
Look, this, you keep it real here in this space, okay? You say what you have to say. People might love it, they might agree, they might hate it, they might disagree. That's okay.
Yeah, I just want to add 100%, it's an investment property. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. You're at not a disadvantage, but you're in a better place than someone who's actually just renting your property. But that being said, not all landlords are bad. Some landlords understand the value of having a good tenant that pays their rent on time, right? They want to be able to keep them, and so they work with the tenant to keep the apartments affordable. But certainly small landlords can have and act in predatory ways, right? Where they want to have a tenant who's going to be paying a higher rent, and that sometimes means getting rid of the tenant that they have that's paying less. And so, yeah, it kind of depends on who the owner is, and it also depends. Sometimes they're influenced by what's happening in those communities. And so I think that we don't hear enough about good landlords, but there's some of them that are out there and they're doing the right thing because they're doing right by their tenant and they want to be able to keep them. And so that there's this understanding that they need to keep the rent affordable and they can secure having a steady flow of income coming in.
Yeah, I think that's, those are really good insights. I mean, I think that the landlord bit is tricky. And part of the reason why it's tricky is because we have this context where it's like, it's the American dream and you want to be upwardly mobile. And how do you gain that upward mobility? Through investment. And what is the primary mechanism of investment in almost everyone's life? Housing, right? Property, either by buying your own home, which many people do because they view it as an investment, or in addition to that, buying other property and renting it out and finding a way to extract profit from land, from housing, from property, right? And that is like so embedded in many ways, culturally in our DNA, certainly in our laws, and sometimes in our self-understandings and our social connections. Like my parents are landlords, my uncle's a landlord. I want to be a landlord one day, right? I'm channeling, right? But so it rubs a little bit to say like, when people feel like, well, you're demonizing the landlords, it rubs a little bit, right? And I don't think that it's even necessary. I mean, sometimes it's warranted and perhaps necessary, but it's not always necessary to demonize landlords. But I think the point that, a profit from housing is not a human right. An investment comes with risks. And you can win big and you can lose big. And so landlords losing is not like, oh my gosh, like this is upending the very foundation of our society. I mean, we should think about the implication it has for our larger economy. But if our economy is going to be so influenced by the welfare of landlords, then that suggests maybe a problem in the way we're structuring our economy. And so I think there's a lot there to think about. But one way I sort of ground myself often is to say, like, making a profit, extracting a profit from land and property is not something anyone's entitled to, but housing is something that everyone's entitled to. So how do we reconcile those realities? It's not simple, it's not straightforward. I think Giancarlo is going to try to wrap us up with kind of a final question. But beforehand, I wanted to quickly make sure we got to some of the floating questions. There's one here about how college students can learn about housing policy. And let me just say, if you're a Cornell student, you can take, for example, my public policy class, and we do a unit on housing. I think the Department of Policy Analysis and Management also has an entire class on housing. But even outside of the classroom context, I think anyone, college student or not college student, that wants to learn about housing can find that there are a variety of resources available now relative to maybe even a year ago or even 2 years ago. You know, every sort of major reputable news outlet is publishing pieces on housing and the housing crisis. Some of those are long form pieces that help us think about, for example, housing and the history of racial justice, housing and how it functions in a capitalist economy. There's so many different aspects of this. And never mind, like I was watching, like I got pulled into a YouTube, like I don't know, a deep rabbit hole last week when I started watching like webinars like this that are on YouTube about all different aspects of housing. So I guess, and it looks like you're typing an answer to this, Professor Rodriguez, because it tells us in live time. So, but all I was going to say, and either of you can answer this question, but all I was going to say was that there are so many resources. And if you're truly looking to engage in this space, there's almost no excuse not to, because like social media, news media, YouTube, and lots of text, some of which are kind of widely available. You know, read Keeanga Yamada Taylor's Race for Profit, read Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law, I mean, we could go on and on and on. There's a lot, right? But what were you gonna say, Professor Rodriguez?
I was going to also suggest documentaries. So there's two good ones. The Pruitt-Igoe Myth people really like, which is about the history of public housing. And there's another one called 70 Acres that's about Cabrini Green in Chicago. Both of those give you really good overviews of public housing and urban renewal and urban redevelopment that would be helpful. But yeah, lots of resources right now about housing.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And okay, so let's jump in, Giancarlo. You can take us down the home stretch here.
Yeah, of course. So I think earlier on, Professor Rodriguez, you mentioned that you know, fixing our housing crisis and ensuring that we have some sort of housing justice isn't going to involve just focusing on housing policy necessarily. And you know, housing policy, there are so many ripples that come out of housing policy affecting other areas of policy, whether that's climate justice or the efficacy of different types of transportation. And so, you know, thinking about all of the effects that those have and, you know, our critiquing of capitalism that we've talked about in this conversation, for both you and Assemblywoman Mitaynes, we were wondering if you could enact one policy right now, what would it be, and would it require some sort of fundamental transformation of you know, the economic system we have right now of capitalism? Just a small question to end, you know.
So there's currently over 1 million unregulated units, and those are in either buildings or a private house of 5 units or less. Tenants have very different rights. There's no, they don't have a right to a lease. The landlord can impose arbitrary rent increases, and the tenants have no defense against an eviction. Prior, these were used as affordable units, but as our communities are beginning to gentrify, what we're seeing is tenants that were living in these types of housings for 10, 20, up to 30 years are suddenly being evicted. And so there is current legislation that's being proposed that would change that and would bring basic tenant protections to these types of units, thus bringing them into the affordable housing stock and providing basic tenant protections to tenants that don't currently have that. That is something that would change with legislation. That's also something that wouldn't cost any money. Certainly, that was one of the bills that was proposed as part of this package of bills that was passed as part of the historic rent laws. That's the one that got left behind. The difference is there was no appetite. You couldn't have a conversation about this before. Now people know and are educated, and it's a very strong possibility, especially during this time of COVID, to be able to give basic tenant protections against evictions, against arbitrary rent increases to tenants during the time of this pandemic. So that's something that can easily change, that wouldn't cost any money here in the state of New York.
Wow, okay, so that's a tough one to follow up because that sounds real and like that will happen by September. And mine is build more public housing, which will take much longer, but the goal is to get all of those tenant protections built into the actual structure as well. So we don't have to worry about new landlords or that sort of turnover, and there's permanently affordable housing that's preserved in different areas. So kind of a mandated census-based distribution of affordable housing units across the country would be amazing. But also just regulating all of the units in New York sounds, that's my number 2. So that's awesome. I love to hear that. That's a high note to end on.
Okay, definitely high notes to end on. And I will say there was a question about property managers, and I just tried to type an answer in the chat, but I have no idea if it's going through. They're definitely important actors here too, and the rest will be in the answer. Okay, so we're coming towards the end of our time here, even though my temptation is to continue to just hold both of you hostage and ask you question after question, because this is an area that I'm so passionate about. And you're two people who I have such deep respect for. So it's like, no, let's stay all night. But at some point, my bird will squeak us all to insanity. If you hear like a eep, eep in the background, or do you hear it? Oh yeah, he's mad. He's like, your work day has been too long. Or my children, who have actually been like surprisingly compliant thus far, will reach the end of their rope. And plus, I mean, people have lives. So in closing, I want to just thank you both. Like, we had some hiccups at the beginning, but I think that we've been able to have such a generative conversation here. And I think the reason why is because you're both drawing on such a deep well of not only Professor Rodriguez kind of academic research and like a kind of vast knowledge, but also like experience and connection to community and to organizing and organization. And I think that is really important. Those are both important, the latter very much so. And so I think we've been able to cover a lot of territory and learn a lot. And thank you to the audience. People have had to go, but like also like were engaged and asking questions. this is hard stuff, like thinking about housing, about how to reconcile housing as a social right with capitalism as our economic system, about how to reconcile the fact that some of the actors in this system are people who we know and love, like landlords or property managers, about how to reconcile like really the weight and the scope and the enormity of the work to be done, and the kind of political transformation and processes that will have to occur in order for that work to happen, how to even have the radical imagination to even be able to think about what it means for housing to be a right, for housing to be valued for its social use and not its economic extractive profit. I mean, these are hard things that really push many people outside, including me often, outside of our comfort zones and force us to think. And I think beyond the bounds that our politics can like sometimes put us in, right? Like housing is maybe in a practical sense about partisan politics, but in an ultimate like ethical and moral sense, not really about that, right? It's about human dignity. It's about the way that we want to live and the world that we want to build. And so it's not like this is the Democratic position, this is the Republican position, or this is the progressive position, this is the more moderate liberal. Yes, in reality, all of those things matter and they do end up shaping political processes. But in a much larger way, like we should all be able to think together about what we want for our fellow human beings and what kind of world we want to live in. And I think that both of you tonight have helped us to think about that, both in terms of the details, the nitty gritty, and in terms of the big picture, like the goal, and in terms of the process, right? The politics, the power dynamics underlying all of these things. So there's a ton we didn't get to talk about, but we covered so much ground and it was so enjoyable. And I just want to thank you both and thank our audience for like rolling with us and for engaging these challenging but really vital issues. So
Thank you. This is great. Really wonderful. Thanks to the audience.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, this is dope.
Thank you both so much for coming.
yeah, thanks for coming. Thanks for coming. Have a good night, everybody.
Thanks. Thanks all.